The bitter wind of a New York winter howled through the concrete canyons of Manhattan, carrying with it a relentless flurry of snow that blurred the neon glow of Times Square. At 4:30 a.m., the city that never sleeps was at its quietest, save for the low, rhythmic rumble of a massive Department of Sanitation truck rolling down the slush-covered avenues. Arthur Vance kept his hands clamped tightly around the oversized steering wheel. At 52, Arthur was a man shaped by hard labor and quiet endurance. He wore a standard issue, fluorescent orange high-visibility jacket over a faded flannel shirt, his broad shoulders slightly hunched from the exhaustion of a 12-hour shift. To the few early morning commuters rushing past, he was just another invisible cog in the city's vast machine, a graying, rugged laborer clearing the remnants of yesterday's consumerism. But Arthur's eyes, a deep and piercing amber, held the gaze of a man who had lived a completely different lifetime. As the truck came to a halt near a mountain of discarded trash bags, Arthur pulled his heavy work gloves off. He blew into his palms, trying to restore warmth to his fingers. In the dim, ambient light of the dashboard, his hands were revealed. They were tragic, chiseled with deep, jagged silver scars that twisted tightly from his wrists down to his fingertips. His hands bore the permanent roadmap of a catastrophic house fire 20 years ago, a fire that had consumed his home, his life savings, and his ability to play the instrument that defined his soul. Arthur had once been a maestro, a British-born prodigy whose compositions filled the grandest concert halls of Europe. Now his only stage was the frozen asphalt of New York, and his only audience was the whistling wind. "Hey Vance, move it or we're gonna fall behind schedule," his younger coworker yelled from the passenger side, slamming a hot paper cup of cheap deli coffee onto the console. Arthur didn't answer. He simply nodded, shifted the heavy truck into gear, and drove onward. He didn't care about the freezing cold, the grueling hours, or the heavy scent of decay that clung to his uniform. He only cared about the paycheck. More specifically, he cared about what that paycheck provided. By 6 p.m., his shift was finally over. Exhausted to the bone, Arthur caught the crowded subway down to a neglected neighborhood in Brooklyn. He walked briskly, his old leather work boots crunching against the ice, until he reached a rusted iron gate leading down into a cramped, dimly lit basement apartment. The apartment was freezing, smelling faintly of old paper and damp concrete. But in the center of the small living area sat the only piece of luxury Arthur possessed, a battered, upright Steinway piano from the 1920s, its wood scratched and its ivory keys yellowed with age. Arthur hung his heavy orange coat on a peg and approached the piano. He extended his scarred hands over the keys, his fingers trembling slightly. He lowered his hand to press a middle C, but he stopped a mere millimeter before making contact. He didn't press down. He couldn't risk hearing how his stiff, ruined joints would betray the perfect melody echoing inside his mind. Instead, he let his scarred fingers gracefully dance across the ivory in absolute silence, playing a complex, ghost-like arrangement on a cam piano. The door to the apartment suddenly opened, letting in a swirl of cold air and the bright, energetic presence of a 19-year-old young man. Leo Vance burst into the room, his eyes sparkling with a volatile mixture of disbelief and pure adrenaline. He dropped his worn leather music satchel onto the small kitchen table, his hands shaking as he pulled out an official, heavy cream-colored envelope bearing a gold-embossed seal. "Dad," Leo gasped, his voice cracking with emotion. I got it. It came." Arthur turned around slowly, his chest tightening. He looked at the envelope in his son's hands. "I won the Juilliard Presidential Scholarship." "Dad," Leo whispered, a tear escaping his eye as a massive gap-toothed smile broke across his face. "I'm the top-ranked freshman pianist. I'm going to Juilliard." Arthur closed the distance between them in a single stride. He didn't say a word. His voice had grown increasingly quiet and reclusive over the years, but he wrapped his massive, powerful arms around his son. Pulling Leo into his chest, Arthur closed his eyes, a profound wave of relief and pride washing over him. He looked over Leo's shoulder at the yellowed keys of the silent piano. The fire had stolen his hands, and the world had forced him to carry its trash, but it had not stolen his legacy. Through his son, the music would finally play again. The honeymoon phase of entering the world's most prestigious music conservatory faded quickly, replaced by the crushing, cutthroat reality of Juilliard's competitive halls. For 3 months, Leo Vance threw himself into his studies, his fingers practicing until they bled. But as the winter semester neared its end, a massive hurdle loomed: the year-end jury exhibition. The exhibition required every freshman prodigy to perform a completely original piece of music in front of a panel of world-renowned judges, corporate talent scouts, and high society patrons. A poor performance meant losing a scholarship. A brilliant performance could launch a career. For weeks, Leo sat in the school's practice rooms, staring at blank sheet music. The pressure was paralyzing. Every arrangement he came up with felt hollow, lacking the raw, profound soul required to stand out among the city's elite. Back in the Brooklyn basement, Arthur watched his son deteriorate. Leo would sit at the kitchen table late into the night, pulling at his hair, his eyes bloodshot, discarding crumpled pieces of paper onto the floor. Arthur knew that frustration. He knew how the weight of expectation could crush a young artist's spirit. One evening, while Leo was asleep from pure exhaustion, Arthur quietly pulled an old locked wooden chest from beneath his small bed. He turned a small brass key in the rusted lock, the hinges groaning as the lid opened. Inside lay a collection of yellowed, fragile manuscript papers covered in intricate, elegant handwritten musical notation, the unfinished symphonies of Arthur Vance before the fire. Arthur pulled out a blank ledger book and a fountain pen. He sat down at the wooden table beneath a single blinking light bulb. He closed his eyes, letting his mind drift back 20 years ago. The memory of grand orchestras, the soaring resonance of brass, and the delicate weep of violins flooded his consciousness. He began to write, because his scarred fingers could no longer play the piano. He used the pen to breathe life onto the paper. His pen scratched against the Ho&O sheets throughout the night, translating the deep, beautiful, and melancholic melody raging in his mind into a flawless piano arrangement, a composition he titled The Winter Symphony of a Silent Soul. The next morning, Leo woke up to the smell of cheap coffee and found a neat stack of handwritten musical scores resting beside his keyboard satchel. "Dad? What is this?" Leo asked, rubbing his eyes as he picked up the manuscript. Arthur stood by the small stove, his back turned, nodding gently toward the papers. Leo sat down at the battered upright piano and placed the first page on the music stand. He carefully placed his fingers on the keys and played the opening chords. The room instantly transformed. The melody began with a heavy, solemn progression that perfectly captured the cold, isolated weight of a New York winter. But as Leo's fingers moved across the page, the music began to swell, shifting into a breathtaking, triumphant cascade of notes that spoke of absolute resilience, unspoken love, and an unyielding human spirit. It was an arrangement of such immense technical complexity and profound beauty that it felt almost superhuman. Leo stopped playing, his hands hovering over the keys, his breath completely caught in his throat. He looked up at his father, his eyes wide with absolute reverence and realization. "Dad, you wrote this?" Leo whispered, his voice trembling. This isn't just a student piece. This is a masterpiece. I've never felt music like this before." Arthur walked over, his heavy boots soft against the linoleum. He placed a rough, scarred hand gently on his son's shoulder. He looked into Leo's eyes and used his hands to make a few slow, deliberate sign language gestures, followed by a soft, rare whisper. "Play it with your soul, Leo," Arthur whispered, his voice raspy from decades of disuse. "Let them hear the music they tried to bury." Leo gripped the pages tightly against his chest, the heavy cloud of doubt completely vanishing from his mind. With his father's final masterpiece in his hands, he felt ready to face the world, completely unaware that the brilliant melody would soon paint a massive target on his back. The grand practice halls of the Juilliard school were alive with the sound of elite ambition, but room 402 belonged entirely to a different realm. For 3 days straight, Leo Vance had been locked inside, his fingers moving across the polished keys of the conservatory's grand piano. He was no longer playing just notes. He was breathing his father's history, pouring the collective pain and unspoken resilience of their basement apartment into every single chord progression. Outside the soundproof glass door, a small crowd of students and faculty had quietly gathered, drawn in by the hypnotic, devastatingly beautiful melody of the Winter Symphony of a Silent Soul. The music was completely unlike anything the modern conservatory had produced. It possessed a classical majesty that felt heavy with historical brilliance, yet carried a raw contemporary ache that could shatter a listener's heart. Among those watching through the glass was a man who did not look like an academic, clad in a pristine midnight blue bespoke suit, with silver hair slicked back perfectly and cold, calculating gray eyes. Julian Vance, CEO of Vanguard Music Group, stood perfectly still. Julian was a kingmaker in the global entertainment industry, a billionaire mogul whose Times Square penthouse tower dictated what the world listened to. He had come to Juilliard that afternoon to scout a generic prodigy for a corporate commercial campaign. But the moment this specific melody reached his ears, his entire body locked in absolute icy shock. 20 years ago, Julian had built the foundation of his multi-billion-dollar empire on a stolen masterpiece, a brilliant concerto written by a rising British prodigy named Arthur Vance, right before a mysterious house fire wiped the genius from the map. For 2 decades, Julian believed that Ghost was safely buried. Yet here, in a random Juilliard practice room, a young boy was playing a piece that utilized the exact, inimitable harmonic shifts and secret melodic signatures that only Arthur Vance could ever conceive. Julian's eyes narrowed as he looked at the nameplate resting on the piano. Leo Vance, a dark, predatory smile tugged at the corner of Julian's mouth. The ghost hadn't returned. It had merely left an air. When the final, soaring chord died out in the room, Leo slumped over the keys, catching his breath. The soundproof door swung open, and the heavy scent of expensive cologne filled the space. "Magnificent," Julian said, clapping his hands slowly, his voice smooth and dripping with artificial warmth. "An absolute masterclass, young man. I haven't heard a soul cry through a piano like that in 20 years. Leo jumped up, startled, instantly recognizing the legendary music tycoon whose face graced the covers of every major financial and arts magazine. Mr. Julian?" "Thank you, sir. I didn't know anyone was listening. The whole floor was listening, Leo," Julian replied smoothly, walking closer and placing a patronizing hand on the young man's shoulder. He looked down at the handwritten manuscript sheets resting on the music stand, his heart hammering against his ribs as he recognized the elegant, sharp fountain pen notation. It was undeniably Arthur's handwriting. "Tell me, did you compose this yourself?" "My father wrote it for me, sir," Leo said proudly, his innocence completely blinding him to the danger standing before him. "He wrote it to save my scholarship for the exhibition." Julian's eyes flashed with a lethal confirmation. "Arthur is still alive. Your father is a genius, Leo. But a piece this grand doesn't belong in a school exhibition," Julian said, his tone adopting the comforting weight of a benevolent savior. "It belongs on a global stage, Carnegie Hall, streaming platforms worldwide. I want to sign you to Vanguard Music Group today. I want to give you a $1 million development contract, clear your family's debts, and produce this symphony ourselves." Leo's breath caught completely in his throat. $1 million, the image of his father's scarred hands, the freezing cold of their basement home, and the exhausting 12-hour shifts hauling the city's trash flashed through his mind. He could save his father. He could pull them out of the dirt forever. "A contract, sir?" Leo stammered, his hands shaking. I don't have a manager or a lawyer." "You don't need one with me, son," Julian lied seamlessly, reaching into his leather briefcase and pulling out a thick official document bearing the gold-embossed Vanguard seal. "This is our standard Prodigy Scholarship Development Agreement. It ensures you get an immediate cash advance tonight. We handle the lawyers, the distribution, and the studio time. You just focus on the music." He handed Leo a sleek gold pen. Julian's finger tapped lightly against the signature line at the very back of the document. Hidden deep within page 47, wrapped in dense, deceptive legal jargon, was a clause that permanently transferred all intellectual property rights, publishing rights, and authorship credit of the manuscript, and any future works associated with it, to Vanguard Music Group in perpetuity, for a fraction of its true value. "Sign right here, Leo," Julian whispered, his eyes locked onto the boy like a hawk watching its prey. "Let's change your father's life forever." Overwhelmed by emotion, gratitude, and a naive desire to rescue his family, Leo didn't read the fine print. He pressed the gold pen to the paper and signed his name, completely unaware that he had just signed away his father's soul to the very monster who had destroyed it 20 years ago. The neon lights of Times Square sliced through the glass facade of the Vanguard Tower, casting sharp lines of blue and crimson across Julian's sprawling penthouse office. The office was a monument to modern, untouchable wealth, Polished marble floors, multi-million-dollar modern art installations, and a grand panoramic view of the Manhattan skyline. Julian sat comfortably behind his minimalist obsidian desk, swirling a glass of expensive scotch, when the glass double doors of his executive lobby were suddenly thrown open with a violent force. "Sir, you cannot be up here. Security is on their way," a frantic secretary screamed from the hallway. Stepping into the pristine luxury of the penthouse was a figure that looked like an absolute anomaly. Arthur Vance stood in the doorway, his broad frame breathing heavily, still clad in his standard issue, fluorescent orange high-visibility sanitation jacket and worn, oil-stained flannel shirt. His heavy leather work boots were encrusted with the gray slush and grime of the New York streets, leaving dark, messy tracks on the immaculate marble floor. He held a copy of the Vanguard contract tightly in his scarred, trembling fist. He had found the document on the kitchen table an hour ago, read the predatory clauses, and realized instantly what Julian had done to his son. The old nightmare had returned. Julian didn't flinch. He slowly set his glass down, a cruel, mocking sneer stretching across his face as he looked at the rugged laborer standing before him. "Well, well, well, look what the tide washed up. Arthur Vance. I must admit, when my legal team confirmed you were still breathing, I pictured you in a lot of places. But driving a New York trash truck? That is poetry, Arthur. Pure poetry." Arthur took 3 steps forward, his boots heavy against the marble. He didn't have a voice to shout, but his amber eyes burned with a terrifying protective rage. He slammed the contract down onto Julian's obsidian desk. His scarred fingers splayed out against the glossy surface. Arthur raised his hands, his movements sharp, furious, and precise as he utilized sign language to demand justice, his jaw clenched so tightly the bones looked ready to snap. When Julian simply laughed, Arthur forced a deep, rasping sound from his scarred throat, a voice ruined by the smoke of the fire decades ago. "Void the contract," Arthur whispered, the words costing him an immense physical agony to produce. "You stole from me 20 years ago. You will not take my son." Julian slowly leaned forward, his polished, elite demeanor completely slipping away to reveal the cold, ruthless monster underneath. "Stole from you? Arthur, look at yourself. You are a ghost. You are covered in the city's filth. You smell of garbage and exhaust. Who is going to believe you? To the world, you are a washed-up, crippled drifter trying to extort a billionaire tycoon." Julian stood up, looking down at Arthur with unadulterated contempt. "Your son signed that paper willingly. Vanguard owns that symphony now. We own the rights, we own the masters. And if I choose to put my own name on the credits as the composer, there isn't a damn thing your silent tongue can do to stop me. Now, take your pathetic orange jacket and get the hell out of my building before I have you thrown into a cage." Arthur didn't retreat. Defying the power of the billionaire, he reached out with his powerful, calloused hand, grabbing the edge of the original manuscript papers that sat on Julian's desk, attempting to take them back. "Security, get in here right now." Julian roared, his face twisting into an ugly mask of rage. Instantly, 4 large, broad-shouldered private security guards clad in black tactical uniforms burst into the penthouse office. They slammed into Arthur from behind, ruthlessly wrenching his scarred arms backward and forcing the older man down onto his knees against the hard marble floor. Arthur struggled with the immense physical strength of a laborer, but the guards applied more pressure, their heavy boots digging into his back. Julian walked over, looking down at Arthur, who was pinned to the floor. Julian took the manuscript papers from Arthur's grip, tore them in half with a slow, deliberate movement, and threw the shredded pieces directly into Arthur's face. "Look at you, Arthur. You're just rack-rie," Julian spat, his voice dripping with venomous elitism. "Throw this garbage out on the street. If he ever sets foot in Times Square again, break his legs." The security guards brutally dragged Arthur backward through the executive lobby, his boots scraping helplessly against the floor. They threw him out of the service elevators and slammed him down onto the cold, wet pavement of the alleyway outside the tower, right beneath the freezing New York rain. Arthur lay on the asphalt, his uniform torn, his body bruised, and the shredded remains of his music swirling in the dirty puddles around him. He stared up at the towering glass monolith of Vanguard Entertainment, his chest heaving in silent, agonizing despair. The elite world had chewed him up and spat him out once again, but as he slowly pushed himself up from the wet concrete, his eyes hardened into a steel resolve. The monster had taken his hands, his career, and his dignity, but Arthur would die before he let them take his son. The freezing rain of New York had turned the slush on the sidewalks into a treacherous, icy glaze. Pushed brutally from the service exit of Vanguard Tower, Arthur Vance collapsed onto the cold concrete of the alleyway. The heavy impact sent a sharp jolt of pain through his shoulder, but he barely felt it. His amber eyes were fixed entirely on the dirty puddles around him, where the shredded remnants of the winter symphony of a silent soul floated, the ink slowly dissolving into the gray water. He tried to gather the torn pages with his stiff, scarred fingers, but the wind tore them away, scattering his life's final masterpiece into the dark corners of the Manhattan streets. Pinned down and humiliated by the tactical guards just moments before, Arthur's body was bruised, his neon-orange sanitation jacket torn open at the seam. For 20 years he had endured the invisible status of a garbage collector, swallowing his pride to keep a roof over his son's head. But as he sat in the freezing rain, the absolute, crushing weight of his powerlessness pressed down on his chest like a physical anchor. He could not speak to defend himself. His hands were ruined, and the elite world had drawn its borders firmly to keep him on the outside. Inside the glass lobby of Vanguard Tower, 19-year-old Leo Vance was stepping out of an executive elevator, clutching a copy of his scholarship confirmation. He had been guided to a lower-level studio to wait while Julian's legal team processed the final paperwork. But as the minutes ticked by, a sudden, heavy wave of anxiety had gripped the young pianist. He remembered the cold look in Julian's eyes when the tycoon mentioned his father, a look that didn't match the artificial warmth of his words. As Leo walked toward the revolving glass doors, a loud commotion near the side exit caught his attention. Several corporate executives were murmuring, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows with judgmental smiles. "Unbelievable," a junior executive laughed, adjusting his tie. "Some homeless guy in a city worker's jacket tried to storm the penthouse to extort the CEO. Security handled him real quick. Left him throwing a tantrum out in the rain." Leo's heart stopped. City worker's jacket. Before the receptionist could call out to stop him, Leo sprinted across the polished marble lobby, threw open the heavy glass side doors, and burst out into the freezing afternoon air. The blinding neon billboards of Times Square flashed violently above, casting chaotic streaks of crimson and gold across the wet pavement. Leo pushed his way through a gathering crowd of curious tourists and corporate employees who had stopped to watch the spectacle. He broke through the perimeter, and the sight that met his eyes shattered his world completely. "Dad!" Leo screamed. His voice cracking with an agonizing, raw terror, he threw himself down onto the wet concrete, completely ignoring the freezing slush soaking through his conservatory trousers. Arthur was slowly pushing himself up, his face pale, his hands shaking as he tried to gather a single torn scrap of music paper. The powerful, unyielding father who had been Leo's anchor his entire life looked incredibly fragile, broken by the very institution Leo had naively dreamed of joining. "Dad, oh my God, what did they do to you?" Leo sobbed, his tears mixing with the rain as he wrapped his arms tightly around his father's trembling shoulders. He looked up at the two tactical guards who stood blocking the service entrance, their arms folded, their faces masks of pure, untouchable arrogance. Arthur slowly shook his head, placing a wet, calloused hand against his son's cheek. He didn't want Leo to see him like this. He used his scarred fingers to make a single slow gesture in sign language. "Go back inside, protect your future." "No, I'm not leaving you," Leo cried out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls of the alleyway, drawing the attention of dozens of onlookers who had gathered with their smartphones raised. "They did this to you. Julian did this to you." High above the alley, standing on the glass balcony of the executive floor, Julian Vance looked down at the scene, a glass of scotch resting in his hand. He watched the young prodigy weeping over the garbage collector, his face twisted into a smug, victorious smile. To Julian, the contract was signed, the music was secure, and the past was officially erased. He turned away from the glass, completely unbothered by the human wreckage he had left on the pavement below, ready to prepare for the most important meeting of his billionaire career. The subdued atmosphere of the alleyway shifted dramatically as a fleet of 3 pristine black Maybach sedans turned the corner onto the main plaza of Vanguard Tower. The vehicles glided smoothly over the wet asphalt, their polished chrome grills gleaming under the neon lights of Times Square. Dozens of high society reporters, music critics, and paparazzi immediately surged against the velvet ropes lined up along the red carpet at the tower's grand main entrance, their cameras primed. The door to the central limousine was opened by an obsequious executive assistant, and a man of immense cultural gravity stepped out. Maestro Anton Laurent had arrived in New York. At 65, Laurent was a living legend, the ultimate maestro of Europe, the principal conductor of the Vienna Philharmonic, and a global musical icon whose authority dictated the prestige of the classical world. Dressed in an immaculate black cashmere overcoat, a silk scarf draped elegantly around his neck, Laurent carried himself with the quiet, untouchable majesty of old-world royalty. He had flown across the Atlantic to finalize a historic, multi-million-dollar distribution partnership between Vanguard Entertainment and the elite concert halls of Europe. Julian Vance hurried down the grand stone steps of his tower, his face split into a wide, theatrical smile as he extended a hand in greeting. Maestro Laurent, welcome to New York. The entire board of trustees is waiting upstairs. We have the finest vintage prepared to celebrate the dawn of our new era. Maestro Laurent offered a polite, measured nod. Stepping onto the red carpet, flashbulbs erupted around them, painting the rainy afternoon in brilliant sheets of white light. Julian gestured toward the grand glass entrance, eager to usher the legend away from the side alley where the minor disruption was still unfolding. But as Laurent took his first step toward the doors, a sharp, emotional cry echoed from the side plaza. Cutting through the whir of camera shutters and the roar of Manhattan traffic, Laurent stopped dead in his tracks. His gray eyebrows pinched together as his sharp ears caught the distinct tone of a young man weeping in absolute despair. He turned his head slowly, his gaze bypassing the red carpet, skipping over the billionaire tycoon standing beside him, and landing directly on the dirty concrete steps of the side alley. There, just 20 feet away, a young boy was kneeling in the freezing slush, desperately trying to protect an older sanitation worker whose bright orange jacket was torn and stained with grease. "Maestro, please?" "Ignore the local vagrants," Julian said quickly, a cold spike of panic hitting his chest as he tried to place himself between Laurent and the alleyway. "Security had an incident with a trespasser. We are clearing the area immediately. Right this way." Laurent didn't move. He ignored Julian entirely, his eyes narrowing as he stared at the older worker's face. The man's graying hair was soaked with rain, his jaw clenched in silent dignity as he comforted the boy. But it was the man's hands that caused the European maestro's breath to catch completely in his throat. Even beneath the grime and the rain, the intricate silver-chiseled sao that twisted across the worker's hands were unmistakable. They were hands that Laurent had studied, hands that had once guided his own young fingers across the piano keys decades ago in London. Before the tragic fire that changed the course of musical history, Julian watched in horror as Maestro Laurent's elite, composed demeanor completely disintegrated. The cashmere overcoat rustled as the European legend broke away from the red carpet, pushing past his own security guards and stepping directly into the cold, dirty slush of the alleyway. "Maestro Laurent, where are you going?" Julian yelled, his voice cracking with a sudden desperate panic as he scrambled to follow. The paparazzi and reporters moved with them, a chaotic wave of cameras tracking the legend as he approached the sanitation worker. Leo Vance looked up, his eyes bloodshot, ready to defend his father from another attack. But Maestro Laurent didn't look at Leo with judgment. He didn't see the dirty orange jacket or the muddy work boots. His hands trembled violently as he stared down at Arthur Vance's amber eyes. Without a single care for the designer clothes he wore, or the hundreds of cameras capturing his every movement, the ultimate maestro of Europe dropped heavily onto his knees right into the freezing, dirty puddle. He reached out, his long fingers gently, reverently grasping Arthur's scarred wrists. Tears welled up in the European legend's eyes, streaming down his face in front of the entire Chundont press corps. Laurent whispered, his voice shaking with a profound, raw emotion that silenced the entire street. "Oh my God, Master, it is really you. I have searched for you across the world for 20 years. The alleyway went entirely, suffocatingly quiet save for the patter of the rain. Julian Vance froze on the pavement, his face turning an ash-gray color as his multi-billion-dollar empire began to fracture beneath his feet. The mask had slipped, the ghost had a voice, and the true master of the symphony had finally been revealed. The suffocating silence that gripped the rain-slicked alleyway outside Vanguard Tower was heavier than the winter storm. Flashbulbs continued to fire in erratic, blinding bursts, their white reflections cutting through the dark puddles where the remnants of Arthur Vance's legacy floated. Dozens of reporters, high society critics, and paparazzi stood frozen behind the velvet ropes, their breath visible in the frigid air, their cameras capturing a scene that defied all comprehension. Maestro Anton Laurent, the living legend of Europe, the man whose baton controlled the prestigious Vienna Philharmonic, remained on his knees in the freezing mud. His custom-tailored coat was soaked, and the hem of his trousers was stained with gray city slush, but he didn't care. His long, elegant fingers trembled violently as they held Arthur Vance's scarred, calloused wrists. Tears streamed openly down the legend's face, carving clean tracks through the rain on his cheeks. "Master," Laurent whispered again, his voice breaking with a raw reverence that vibrated down the narrow alleyway. "It is you. The harbor authorities, the police. They all said you perished in London. They told me the music was gone." Arthur looked down at his former student. For 20 years, he had lived as a phantom in the underbelly of Manhattan, hiding his disfigured hands inside heavy canvas gloves, moving through the streets unnoticed. He had accepted his fate as a ghost, but looking into the eyes of Anton Laurent, the armor of anonymity he had carefully built began to crumble. He raised his left hand slowly, his scarred fingers making a series of quiet, fluid motions in sign language, a private greeting only a master and his favorite pupil would recognize. Laurent gasped, fresh tears welling in his eyes as he recognized the unspoken vocabulary of his youth. "I never forgot, master. Every concerto I conducted, every stage I stood upon across Europe, it was your instruction. Your soul was in every note behind them." Julian Vance felt the ground beneath his feet give way. The multi-billion-dollar tycoon stood frozen, the half-empty glass of expensive scotch slipping from his fingers and shattering against the concrete. The crisp, polished arrogance that normally radiated from his midnight blue suit vanished, replaced by a sudden, terrifying panic. His silver hair became disheveled under the pouring rain, and his face drained of all color until it matched the pale stone of his tower. "Maestro Laurent," Julian stammered, stepping forward with his hands raised in a desperate attempt at damage control. "Please get up. This is an administrative misunderstanding. This man, he is a sanitation worker. He has no credentials. He has a history of mental instability." "Silence, you thief," Laurent roared, his voice carrying the immense, commanding weight of a conductor silencing an entire orchestra. The European legend stood up slowly, his tall frame towering over the billionaire. He brushed the wet slush from his knees but kept his gaze locked onto Julian with a cold, absolute fury. "You dare call him a vagrant?" Laurent's voice shook with indignation as he stepped between Julian and Arthur, shielding his master from the tycoon's gaze. "This man is Arthur Vance. He is the British royal prodigy who redefined classical harmony before the turn of the century. He is the true author of the Vanguard Concerto that built your entire media empire. I was his student in London, when you were nothing but a desperate low-tier publisher scavenging for scraps." A collective gasp rippled through the press corps. The cameras turned instantly from Laurent to Julian, capturing the tycoon's pale, trembling expression. The reporters began shouting questions, the microphones thrust forward like weapons. The hidden identity of the Manhattan trash collector was no longer a secret. The ghost had been given a voice, and the truth was unraveling live in front of the global media. Leo Vance stood beside his father, his bloodshot eyes wide with a mixture of shock and realization. He looked at the scarred hands of his father, then at the living legend who called him master. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the complex handwriting on the manuscript, the superhuman beauty of the arrangement, and the deep, melancholic sorrow that inhabited their basement apartment. His father wasn't just a laborer, he was a king who had sacrificed his crown to protect his son from the wolves of the industry. Arthur slowly reached out, his strong, calloused hand grasping Leo's shoulder. He didn't need words to speak. His amber eyes looked into his son's, projecting an unyielding, protective strength that told Leo the nightmare was finally coming to an end. The grand executive boardroom on the penthouse floor of Vanguard Tower was designed to project absolute, untouchable authority, but today it felt like a courtroom. The panoramic windows showed the Manhattan skyline shrouded in gray fog, reflecting the bleak reality that had overtaken the multi-billion-dollar corporation. Maestro Anton Laurent sat at the head of the long obsidian conference table, his cashmere coat discarded, his posture rigid with an ice-cold professional fury. Sitting directly beside him was Arthur, still wearing his torn flannel shirt and damp leather boots, completely unbothered by the luxury of the room. Leo sat on his father's other side, holding the original copy of the predatory Vanguard development contract. Julian Vance stood near the corner of the room, his tie loosened, his hands shaking as he poured himself another glass of water. The board of trustees sat in terrified silence along the perimeter, checking their phones as the company's stock valuation plummeted in real time following the scandal in the alleyway. "The contract is null and void," Maestro Laurent announced, his voice slicing through the boardroom with absolute finality. He slammed his fountain pen down onto the table. "Hidden clauses of copyright alienation under page 47. Deceptive legal practices targeting a minor student without legal representation. If your legal team attempts to enforce this predatory document for even a second, Vanguard Entertainment will face a joint international lawsuit filed by the Ministry of Culture in Vienna and the Arts Council of Great Britain." "Maestro, please," Julian pleaded, his voice thin and hollow, a desperate shadow of the man who had torn Arthur's music hours earlier. "We can rewrite the terms. We can offer Leo a $10 million advance. We can credit Arthur as the co-composer of the legacy catalog. We don't have to destroy the partnership." "There is no partnership, Julian," Laurent replied coldly, his gaze narrowing. "Effective immediately, the Vienna Philharmonic cancels all distribution, licensing, and broadcast agreements with Vanguard Music Group. I have already contacted the primary classical festivals across Paris, London, and Berlin. By tomorrow morning, Vanguard will be completely blacklisted from every major symphonic stage in the civilized world." A low moan of despair escaped from one of the senior board trustees. To be severed from the European classical market was a fatal blow. Vanguard's prestige was built on those international partnerships, and without them the corporation was nothing but an empty shell. "And as for the Winter Symphony that you tried to steal," Laurent continued, looking at Leo with a proud, warm smile, "Vanguard will return the masters, the digital rights, and the original physical manuscripts to the Vance family by 5 o'clock today. My private foundation will personally finance the premiere exhibition at Carnegie Hall. Leo Vance will perform as the lead pianist, and his name and his father's name will be the only ones printed on the historical marquee." Julian's knees buckled. He stumbled forward, crossing the marble floor until he dropped heavily onto the ground right before Arthur's damp, mud-stained boots. The billionaire mogul, the kingmaker of Manhattan, was reduced to a desperate beggar, his hands clawing at the edge of Arthur's worn flannel sleeve. "Arthur, please," Julian gasped, tears of pure terror spilling over his expensive chiseled jawline. "Don't let him do this. I built this tower. I built this legacy. If you sat me from Europe, the banks will call in the loans. I'll lose everything. Remember London, Arthur. Remember what we were." Arthur Vance looked down at the man who had stolen his hands, his house, and his youth 20 years ago. He didn't strike Julian. He didn't force a broken rasp from his throat to mock him. He simply stood up slowly, pulling his sleeve away from the tycoon's desperate grip with a quiet, devastating dignity. Arthur raised his hands, his movements calm and perfectly measured as he executed 3 slow sign language gestures. "The trash has been cleared." Without a single backward glance, Arthur placed his large arm around Leo's shoulders and walked toward the executive elevators, his heavy boots leaving a final trail of New York sludge on the marble floor. Behind them, Julian Vance remained collapsed against the obsidian desk, weeping silently as the glass monolith of his empire shattered into 1,000 pieces around him. 3 months had passed since the glass monolith of Vanguard Entertainment shattered beneath the weight of its own deception. The fierce winter storm that had once chilled the alleys of Manhattan had softened into a gentle, crisp spring breeze, sweeping across the Grand Avenue outside Carnegie Hall. Tonight, the historic venue, a sacred temple of musical excellence, was bathed in a breathtaking, brilliant golden illumination. The large, elegant marquee over the main entrance cast a warm glow onto the bustling crowd below. displaying a single triumphant headline in bold letters. The worldwide premiere of the Winter Symphony of a Silent Soul by Arthur Vance and Leo Vance. The street was a vibrant, chaotic symphony of high society excitement. Elite music critics, international patrons of the arts, and paparazzi lined the velvet ropes, their camera flashbulbs creating a continuous dazzling sheet of white light. Inside the majestic auditorium, the atmosphere was thick with intense, reverent anticipation. Thousands of guests in immaculate evening gowns and tailored tuxedos filed into the rows of polished mahogany seats, speaking in hushed, excited whispers, but down in the center of the very front row sat the most prominent group of the evening. Maestro Anton Laurent stood quietly near his designated seat, chatting amiably with members of the international press. Beside him sat a row of seats reserved exclusively for special guests. Sitting comfortably in the central leather chair was Arthur Vance. Arthur was completely transformed. The standard issue fluorescent orange sanitation jacket and the oil-stained flannel shirt were gone forever. Tonight, he was dressed in an elegant, custom-tailored dark charcoal suit that fit his broad-shouldered frame with absolute perfection. His graying hair was neatly styled, and his sharp amber eyes held a serene, profound peace. His scarred hands, the hands that had once been hidden inside heavy work gloves, the tragic hands chiseled by fire, now rested openly on his lap. His fingers gently interlocked. He looked around the breathtaking, vaulted hall not with a sense of intimidation, but with the quiet, undeniable authority of a master who had finally returned to the kingdom that belonged to him. The overhead crystal chandeliers slowly flickered and dimmed into absolute darkness. A heavy collective hush fell over the massive audience. Away behind the heavy velvet curtain, the stage lights surged to life with a dramatic brilliance, casting a warm, concentrated spotlight onto the polished wooden floorboards. In the center of the stage sat a magnificent, glossy black Steinway grand piano, its surface catching the gleam of the lights. Then 19-year-old Leo Vance stepped into the light. The auditorium erupted into polite, expectant applause as Leo walked with quiet, measured steps toward the piano. He wore a crisp, tailored black tuxedo, his eyes clear and burning with a deep, unshakable confidence. He didn't look at the thousands of wealthy patrons or the rows of elite critics. His wide, expressive eyes locked instantly onto his father's silhouette in the center of the front row. Arthur offered his son a slow, encouraging nod, his lips curving into a proud, gentle smile. Leo took a deep breath, sat down at the grand instrument, and raised his hands over the keys. For a single breathless second, the entire theater remained in absolute stillness. Then, his fingers pressed down, the opening chords of the Winter Symphony of a Silent Soul filled the vaulted space with an immense, devastating beauty. The melody began with a heavy, solemn progression that captured the bitter, isolated cold of their Brooklyn basement and the exhausting 12-hour shifts hauling the city's trash. It was a raw, heartbreaking reflection of a father's silent sacrifice. But as Leo's hands moved fluidly across the keys, the arrangement began to shift, swelling into a magnificent, triumphant cascade of notes that spoke of an unyielding human spirit and a love that could not be buried by smoke or dirt. Leo owned the stage. His technique was flawless, executing complex, superhuman harmonic progressions with an innate grace that held the entire audience utterly spellbound. He wasn't just projecting his voice for the conservatory or the critics. He was speaking directly to the man who had translated the music from his mind onto the paper. Under the brilliant stage lights, Arthur watched his son play, his chest tightening with a profound emotional warmth. He closed his eyes, letting the music wash over his soul. For 20 years, his own hands had been silenced, forced to carry the weight of a world that didn't see him. But tonight, listening to the soaring majesty of the concerto, Arthur realized his legacy had never truly died. Every note Leo struck was a victory over the elitism, the bias, and the cruelty that had tried to destroy them. His silent keys had finally found their voice. When the final magnificent chord reverberated through the hall and slowly faded into silence, there was a momentary, breathless pause. Then the auditorium erupted. The applause was deafening, a thunderous roar that shook the very foundation of Carnegie Hall. The thousands of patrons, the critics, and Maestro Laurent rose to their feet in a massive standing ovation. Arthur Vance was the first among them, standing tall and proud, clapping his large, scarred hands with an emotion that radiated from his entire being. Leo stood up from the piano, tears of pure joy streaming down his face as the crowd cheered. But instead of remaining on the stage to receive the accolades, he stepped down from the platform, bypassed the security ropes, and rushed directly into his father's waiting arms. Arthur caught his son effortlessly, pulling him into a powerful, protective embrace. He buried his face in Leo's hair, feeling a wave of absolute peace wash over his heart. "You did it, Leo," Arthur whispered, his raspy voice carrying a father's pure devotion. "They hear you. They hear the music." Leo pulled back slightly, a brilliant, gap-toothed smile lighting up his face as he looked into his father's amber eyes. "They hear us, Dad," Leo said firmly. "We did it together." Maestro Laurent approached them, placing a reverent hand on Arthur's shoulder, his face split into a proud smile. Around them, the elite world of New York applauded not just the genius of a new prodigy, but the unyielding dignity of the master who had raised him. As the house lights brightened, Arthur looked up at the grand stage, then back at his son. The long journey through the darkness was over. He had stepped out of the shadows of the alleyways, leaving the invisible coat of a laborer behind him forever. He had proven that true dignity, the character of a man's soul and the beauty of his creation, could never be dictated by his appearance or his status. The lesson was learned, the stolen glory was reclaimed, and as Arthur walked out into the crisp spring air with his son beside him, he knew their symphony would play on for generations to come.